evening. It is InfoWars Nightly News. The date is the 29th day of September 2011 on this Thursday night transmission. Coming up, we've done a boil down of an interview we did with Dr. Paul Connett on the documented dangers of fluoride in the water. And we have several experts in studio tomorrow night and a report we've been working on for over a week on the dangers of fluoride, including footage shot inside the Austin water treatment plant and restaurants in Austin that are putting up signs saying they have special filtration to have fluoride-free water. So the revolution against this forced toxic waste medication that's put in our water supply will be aired tomorrow night on the Friday edition, very special edition of InfoWars Nightly News. It's so important for you, members of PrisonPlanet.tv viewers, to get this report tonight and tomorrow night out to everybody you know, and it is you out there that are making this possible. Then Mike Adams with some incredible revelations and a challenge he's announcing for environmentalists coming up at the end of tonight's transmission. But first, some of the top stories tonight. I've seen this hundreds of times in just the last few years, and it happened again. You always hear the big news announcements. My God, a guy wanted to blow up the Capitol and the Pentagon. And then you learn, and they admit, that the government basically sawed out a nut, gave him the little airplane, gave him the plastic explosive, gave him the guns, gave him the hand grenades, and he was being led by the FBI. So the FBI has stopped their own terror plot, kind of like in 1993 with the first World Trade Center attack, where they cooked the bomb, trained the driver, and let it all go forward. That was all confirmed at the time. Absolutely amazing that that's going on. You know, we've been covering the Occupy Wall Street movement that's quite diverse, that's been happening now for almost 2 weeks there in Lower Manhattan. And we've since seen a video of women just trying to videotape people being arrested for no reason, being pepper sprayed by Tony Baloney. That was the name of the officer that actually did that. You can't make this stuff up out of central casting. The name certainly fits, Mr. Tony Baloney. I'm not bashing folks with the name Baloney, but you got to admit it's funny. I mean, this is baloney. This is happening. And now it's been confirmed that multiple journalists, you see one of the articles on screen, would just be trying to videotape or photograph from a distance, and cops would beat them up. And then, of course, that was caught on camera, and then they would beat up that person. But there's so many cameras, they can't stop the signal from getting out to people. And regardless of what you think of the Wall Street protesters, you should support their free speech, or we're just like China with Tiananmen Square. All right, we're going to go ahead and go to this very important interview with Dr. Paul Connett on the documented dangers of fluoride.
I think the most important thing to recognize about fluoride is that it's extremely toxic. It is very active biologically, interfering with many basic biochemical processes, enzymes, G proteins, hydrogen bonds, and so on. So it shouldn't surprise us that there's a wide range of health effects that are attributed to fluoride. But the bottom line is that fluoride is extremely active biologically, that the first opponents of fluoridation going back to the 1950s were biochemists, including scientists like James Sumner, who won a Nobel Prize for enzyme chemistry. And incidentally, there is no doubt that fluoride damages health, because millions of people in India, China, and parts of Africa have had their health ruined by fluoride. The people have been crippled by fluoride and many other health effects. The argument, as far as fluoridation is concerned, is there an adequate margin of safety between the doses which cause this known harm, and incidentally documented in this report by the National Research Council published in 2006. Here, a fairly independent, balanced panel looked at the literature for 3 years, and in this 507-page report and 1,100 references indicated that the EPA safe drinking water standard for fluoridation, for fluoride, is 4 parts per million. It's not safe, it's not protective of health, and needs to be lowered. But before I get into the health effects, let me explain my first concern, which remains my top concern. The level of fluoride in mother's milk, mother's breast milk, baby's first meal, is extremely low. It's 0.004 parts per million. That means a bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community in the United States, where we fluoridate the water at 1 part per million, is getting 250 times higher dose of fluoride than a breastfed baby. And that is extremely disturbing. This is a hazardous waste. No question about it. It's not only hexafluorosilicic acid, but it's a lot of crap that Neil was talking about. It's got lead and arsenic and mercury and radioactive isotopes, maybe trace amounts. They can't dump that into the sea by international law. They can't dump it locally because it's too concentrated. But wait for it. If someone buys it from them, you take away the label hazardous waste, and it becomes a product. Becomes a product. And who's going to buy this stuff from them? Oh, our water department. So the water departments buy this hazardous waste, it becomes a product, and now they put it in our drinking water. And now, let me go through the list of health concerns. Some of them are more certain than others. Let me begin with the certain one. Dental fluorosis. Fluoride causes a discoloration, mottling of the tooth enamel. When this practice began in 1945, the promoters of fluoridation thought they could limit dental fluorosis to 10% of the children in its very mild form. And the very mild form has little specks of white, opaque patches on the cusp of the teeth, up to 25%. And they thought that only dentists would notice this, and was an acceptable trade-off with what they thought would be a lowering of tooth decay. Well, in November of 2010, the Center of Disease Control told us that children aged 12 to 15 in the United States, 41% of them now have dental fluorosis. And not only the very mild, but the mild, which impacts up to 50% of the tooth surface, moderate, which impacts up to 100% of the tooth surface, and severe, where you not only have the whole surface impacted, but indentations, chipping of the teeth, and so on. And 3.6% of children aged 12 to 15 in the United States have either moderate or severe dental fluorosis. So that trade-off between lowering tooth decay and producing dental fluorosis, but holding it only to 10%, clearly was a failure. We have 4 times more dental fluorosis as intended and as desired. Our attitude is that when you see this dental fluorosis, it means the child has been overexposed to fluoride, and the question is, what other tissues have been affected? So let's start with the bone, because the teeth are a window into the bone. In fact, the teeth actually grow out of the jawbone, and by the time the permanent teeth have come out, the jawbone has been loaded up with fluoride. And so if you can see the damage to the growing tooth cells, what did the fluoride do to the growing bone cells during this 8, 9, 10 period? In fact, the first study that was published on this in 1955 indicated that the children in the fluoridated community, which was Newburgh, New York, had twice as much cortical bone defects as the children in the non-fluoridated community. Now, the cortical bone is the outside layer of the bone, and that's the layer, it's a lamellar structure, and that part of the bone is meant to protect against fractures. And so the concern then is whether we're increasing bone fractures in children. Well, we had to wait until 2001 before someone investigated this, and researchers in Mexico found a linear correlation. As the severity of dental fluorosis went up, meaning the amount of fluoride the child had been exposed to before the permanent teeth had erupted, as that went up, so did bone fractures in the children. And it was quite striking. When you go from no dental fluorosis to very mild dental fluorosis, it doubled. The bone fractures doubled. Very mild to mild, doubled again. Mild to moderate, doubled again. The next concern about bone is that the first symptoms of bone poisoning in an adult are just like arthritis, stiff joints, pains in the joints, pains in the bone. In the United States, we have 1 in 3 adults now with some form of arthritis. And if you ask a doctor what's causing it, they will say, well, we don't really know, but we think it's got something to do with aging. Well, what also parallels aging, of course, is the number of years you spent in a fluoridated community, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, eventually 60, 70, and so on. The next concern is as the fluoride continues to build up in the bone, and I should say that up to 50% of all the fluoride that we take in each day accumulates in the bone. The fluoride is bioaccumulative. The bones get more brittle. And another major concern is increased hip fractures in adults. A studies done in China, as documented in this National Research Council report, and we further elaborated in our book, The Case Against Fluoride, indicates that levels as low as 3 milligrams per day, that's 3 liters of fluoridated water per day, may increase hip fractures in the elderly. Now, my major concern is not the bones, although I think that's significant. My major concern is the brain, because when the baby is born, the blood-brain barrier is not fully formed. We think the blood-brain barrier keeps fluoride out of the brain most of the time, but for the first half year of the baby's life, the fluoride can get into the brain. And this is not the time, in my view, and the view of many other scientists, that a baby should be exposed to fluoride at 250 times the level in mother's milk. There have now been over 100 animal studies which shows that fluoride damages the brain. There have also been 23 IQ studies, most of them from China, but 1 from India, 1 from Iran, and 1 from Mexico, which show an association between moderate exposure to fluoride and lowered IQ in children. And I actually visited the villages where one of these studies was done. It was a very good study. They controlled for lead, they controlled for iodine. Most of the villages were the 2 villages were almost identical, except for the fact that their well water was different. And the author of this study estimated that the IQ would be lowered at 1.9 parts per million. And that offers no adequate margin of safety for children drinking water at 1 parts per million when you consider the massive range of sensitivity to any toxic effect, and the fact that once you put fluoride in the water, you can't control the dose. Another concern, which many of us have had for many years, is fluoride's impact on the thyroid gland. For between the 30s and the 50s, doctors in Argentina, France, and Germany were giving patients with hyperthyroidism, overactive thyroid gland, sodium fluoride tablets to lower thyroid function. And the doses that they were using were between 2.5 and 4.5 milligrams per day, which is exceeded by many people drinking fluoridated water. For example, the Institute of Medicine actually advises people to drink 3 liters of water a day. So clearly then they would be in the range for lowered thyroid function. And once again, as in many of these other issues, the fluoridating countries, including the United States, are simply not doing the studies. They're not investigating to see if there's a relationship between fluoridation and lowered IQ, fluoridation and arthritis, fluoridation and hypothyroidism. Key health studies have not been done in fluoridated countries. If you don't look, you don't find. They would like to imply, because they don't see anything, there's nothing wrong, but if they're not looking, they won't find. You often hear the promoters say things like, oh, we've been doing this for 60 years. If there's any problem, we would know about it by now. Oh, no, you wouldn't, unless you were doing the studies. Another issue that came out in 1997 was a researcher in England found that fluoride accumulated in the human pineal gland. And the pineal gland is a little gland between the 2 parts of the brain, the 2 hemispheres of the brain. It's not protected by the blood-brain barrier.